So in terms of this issue of sex or gender, again, recognize that we tend to blend these things. When we talk about sex and sex-based discrimination, it is the genetics that we're born to, XX, XY, etc. When we talk about gender, it's typically around the expression of our identity. Whether we identify as a male or female when we're in a body that doesn't quite fit the way that we see ourselves, or whether it's about the gender behaviors that we engage in, the gender norms. What is it, should a woman be, or what is it, should a man be, what's feminine, what is masculine, etc. Men shouldn't wear pink socks, and girls, it's okay for girls to wear jeans. There's all sorts of, double standards out there on how we treat men and women in terms of masculinity and femininity. We know that sexual harassment is being harassed because of your sex, because you're male, because you're female. Quid pro quo means it's the exchange of, sex for sexual favors, for job opportunities. A hostile working environment is where it's very sexually charged, where even though I might not be, propositioning you specifically for sex or for some sort of favors, I have an environment that feels very sexual in nature. In terms of gender norms and stereotypes, again, men have a bind because they're not expected to be feminine. They have to be very masculine. If they don't behave in a stereotyped masculine way, they get harassed as being gay or being sissies or being too femme to be a real man, a man's man. And so men get a lot of problems for that. In terms of for women, there's a double bind, right, for women as well. When women behave in the way that people expect a leader to behave, they're supposed to be assertive and directive and stand up for themselves, they're called bitches, and they're called too aggressive, and they are then they're told to be more feminine. And so, yes, there are issues of legal discrimination around this for mixed motives and stuff, but generally speaking, women get a hit as well when they behave in the way that society expects them to behave. They get told they're not feminine enough. But when they behave in a feminine way, they're not going to get the same opportunities as men when it comes in the workplace. So there's all sorts of norms and stereotypes about what's appropriate and what's not. Pregnancy discrimination, big issue. Even to this day, we still have assumptions about what a pregnant woman can or can't do, and whether or not she should be considered for work. Glass ceiling also affects women, as we discussed with respect to race and gender. And then, we get into this idea of what is transgender or transsexual or intersex, and it makes things much more complex for organizations. And it gets complex around this idea of what do we do about bathroom rights? How do we create a safe place in the bathroom for people to go in and pee if someone feels like there's a man in the woman's room? Well, no, there's a woman in the woman's room. She just happens to, unfortunately, be born in the wrong body. But that's part of the challenge in the education that has to happen around the issues of being transgender. So we'll talk a little bit about that in class. So connecting again with some of the dimensions on that genderbread person is this issue of sexual orientation, and some of the big challenges, of course, we see is marriage rights and versus civil unions and DOMA, and that's pretty much been resolved at this point. The Supreme Court said that we can't deny same-sex couples the right to marry. Religions can, but government cannot. Civil marriages cannot be denied. To same-sex couples. The Defense of Marriage Act was struck down a few years ago, and then in this last year, they finally forced, state governments to recognize that, marriage is appropriate for all people. Civil marriage is appropriate for all people. Civil unions were considered sort of a poor substitute, and Illinois had them for a while, and eventually they came to recognize that civil unions are still less than marriage because the federal government recognized marriage rights, not civil union rights, particularly in terms of Social Security and retirement benefits and things like that. In terms of the impact of sexual orientation in the workplace stuff, well, there's this idea of benefits, and benefits for my partner, benefits for my wife or my husband, and thinking about how do we make sure that we've got benefits that are embracing all family types and in all orientations. A lot of times people say, well, I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to know that you're gay. I don't want to know about your relationship. Well, here's the problem. If you basically tell me you don't want to hear, about the fact that I might have a female partner, and just say, well, okay, it's fine that you're gay. I just don't want to hear about it. Why is it okay for you to put on your desk the picture of your family and your kids and your spouse, who's an opposite sex spouse, and I can't do that because that's considered in your face? And so you can see where that challenge comes into play for folks is, even though you might say, well, I'll accept you, but I don't want to hear about your life. You're asking me to squelch a big part of who I am. I can't share about my family. I can't share about my kids or my partner because I'm not allowed to say something that might imply that I'm in a same-sex relationship. And so that becomes a problem. So a lot of times people just avoid the topic altogether, and they dive deeper into the closet within their workplace. In their private life, they're completely out and comfortable and what have you, but in the workplace, this creates big problems. It creates barriers between the employees. It creates a barrier between a boss and a subordinate. You're constantly hiding. You're constantly checking to make sure no one knows that you're gay or lesbian, or no one knows that you might be, not the norm. It creates an enormous amount of stress, and it creates barriers for building good relationships and good trusting relationships. It also can limit your mobility. If there are organizations out there that discriminate against people who are gay or lesbian, you don't always have the mobility issues that you want. We could talk a little bit more about those career mobility issues. And the last challenge we have is around this conflict between orientation and religion, and how do we reconcile workplace rights? Well, people can express any religious beliefs they want to. That's fine. The organization, typically organizations should not, espouse a particular religious belief if they are not a religious organization. It's okay for, Lutheran, family services to say, we're Lutheran. Well, of course you are, because you are a Lutheran group run by Lutherans to support families. That's a religious organization. But a, local mom and pop store, it's not a religious organization. Should they have the right to, discriminate, and say that there's one religion to be and that's it, and that's always a conflict. And then again, when you have the conflict between sexual orientation and religion, I'm not going to work with that person because they're gay and that's against my religion. Well, your job is to do your job. Your job is not here to poke your nose in someone's bedroom and to know what they're doing and who they're sleeping with, right? I mean, the goal here is we need to accomplish a task to get the job done. You don't have to like me to work with me. You don't have to believe in me. I don't agree with everything that, with everybody that I work with. There's a lot of things that I differ on in terms of different kinds of values. But the fundamental issue is our goal here is not to have a place to have free expression of our values and say, well, because my values are this, I won't work with you. That's not your job. Your job is to do your job, regardless of what your personal values are. And obviously, we don't want to do a job that is in conflict with our values. For example, if the company wants me to work nights and weekends, and that conflicts with my values, that's a totally different story. I wouldn't take that job, right? But in terms of a standard job, the expectation is, because I'm gay, should I not have the same job opportunities as somebody else? And in fact, people get fired for, just because people don't like them because they're gay, and that's a big issue. In terms of age discrimination, obviously there's this assumption that older workers are slower, more resistant to change, and in some circumstances that may be true, but in other circumstances it may be not. I know plenty of older workers who are still very viable, ambitious, want to learn, want to grow. They're not interested in saying this is the only way to be. They have a lot of KSAs, knowledge, skill, and abilities to offer to a company. The older someone is, the more experience they have, they bring more to the table. And we've already spent some time talking about multi-generational workforces, so I won't reiterate that. But you can see where these generational ideas come from, and then all groups have something unique and interesting to offer. In terms of religion, there's a lot of challenges out there right now about the role of religions in the workplace, particularly, Hobby Lobby. Is it a religious organization such that it can say, I don't want to offer these types of benefits? And obviously the Supreme Court said that was okay. Does that mean that they can't offer birth control at all? No. The Catholic Church, again, should it be, as an employer, can they limit people? And that's not always the appropriate way to think about it. Religious minorities, again, there's assumption that everybody is going to be Christian, and that's not the case. There's a wide variety of religious minorities out there. This last slide is dealing with the issue of privilege, and it's hard to get into it in a lot of detail here in this audio file, but as you can see there, privilege is really when you think something is not a problem because it's not a problem to you personally. And so as a white person, I have privilege that I never had to worry about Jim Crow. It was not my experience at all. So my privilege is I never had to worry about where I could walk in and go eat because I took that for granted. Whereas someone who's African American has to be aware of that. I don't worry about being pulled over randomly when I'm driving my car for somebody to say to me, you look like somebody who was accused of a crime and therefore I need to pull you over because you're driving an expensive car. I've known mixed race students of mine that have driven through upper class neighborhoods and they get pulled over because, are you sure you're supposed to be here? Is this where you belong? This is subtle. This is clear racism. And it's definitely a concern. So the goal here in our discussion on privilege in the classroom is going to be more about realizing that being aware that you have privilege is not really a burden or something you should feel guilty about, but just recognizing that it is an experience that's unique to you that other people don't have, and you have to recognize that your experiences are not everybody else's experiences. And we'll get into talking about that a little bit more.